This is Romans 14 Unplugged, Feast and Fast and Food, oh my. We're working our way down through a commentary that is available on my website at tatesaytorah.com. And we've worked our way really kind of around. It's not been the most orderly study, and I apologize for the disorder of the study. But basically, we're in the introduction and background, the background and historical audience section, and we kind of worked our way through this section that I put together after the study. We're working our way to the as I'm scrolling down on the page, we're working our way to the conclusions, and we read some of the conclusions way back in March, way before the Passover season, and then we took a break from the Romans 14 study for the Passover season, and then when we came out of the Passover season, we went through some excursus material with Dr. David Stern, with Tim Hague, and now we're basically ready to jump back into the conclusions. So, but before we do that, let's just look real quick at the kind of the gist of the study. I wanted to read Romans 14 itself, the passage. Maybe I'll do that next week. We'll see. But if you look at the study, let me see, is this the one? Yeah, okay. All right. Let me scroll down past the conclusion for a split second and show you the scope and the style of the study in case you're not familiar where we're going. This, like I said, it's been a few months, and even I get lost in my own studies as to where we're at. All right, and I'm the one who wrote it. Basically, what we're looking at is only chapter 14, but we're taking a broader look at the book as a whole, and we're taking special notice of the situation that occasioned Paul to write it, who were his recipients, what was the social situation there, religious, socio-religious situation, the setting behind the letter, how can we appreciate from today's 21st century perspective, how can we appreciate what the early first century Jews and Gentiles had to go through, and you know, what kind of practical application can we make? You know, that was like 2,000 years ago what they went through. We're certainly not going through the same thing in our local communities today, but nevertheless, we still have some of the same dynamics, Jews and Gentiles in Messiah. We still, of course, lay claim to faith in Yeshua. And so what do we make of this particular letter? If we are to believe that the Holy Spirit has preserved the text so that it is to be a source of teaching for our communities in today's 21st century church communities, Jewish communities, if we are to believe that Jesus is still the Messiah of both Jew and Gentile, then we need to try our best to make some sense of what Paul has left for us. So, like I said, I wanted to read Romans 14, but I'm going to forego that, at least for now. I'll wait maybe another week or 2 weeks when we're done reading down through the conclusionary section, and then we'll read through Romans 14 itself, the whole chapter, and so that we can jump into the study. But for now, let me give you the overview of where my study is going. If you look on my screen right now, basically, I took the chapter 14 and I broke it up into these bullet points. And so let me just tell you the bullet points in advance that we're looking at, and then we'll scroll back up and read through some of the conclusionary statements. We're going to be looking at who are the weak in faith. Right out of the gate, Paul addresses these two groups of people, the weak in faith that he names in 14 verse 1, and then the strong in faith that he names in 15 verse 1, 2, and 3, somewhere around there. So at the beginning of chapter 14, he talks about the weak in faith, and then in 15 verse 1 and 2 and 3, he talks about we who are strong in faith. So there are these two groups, and how does it bear relevance to us today? Do we still have the weak in faith around? Maybe we do, depending on what how you identify the weak in faith. But from Paul's perspective, perhaps there's a group that we don't readily identify with today, but Paul identified with. And is it important enough for us to identify this people group so we can figure out how the letter makes sense to the recipients and what the takeaway is? What was Paul trying to convey to them? Number two, we looked at verses 2 through 4, we're going to be looking at eventually. What is the contrast between anything and vegetables? Paul launches into this discussion about table fellowship. and certain things you can eat and certain things you can't eat, and or perhaps maybe everything is edible. He talks about these two groups again: the weak in faith and strong in faith, and their scruples and their tendencies to judge one another based on what one person chooses to engage in eating or when to eat, things like that. Remember, the study is called Feast, Fast, and Food. Oh my! So there is a lot of discussion around the table fellowship of the first century and how we can make some practical applications for our 21st century table fellowships as well. Indeed, if you just read the chapter, and we're going to do this again, like I said, either next week or the week after, and notice how often Paul uses some terminology related to either food or eating or something like that, you'll notice that it is a dominant theme in this particular chapter, and we'll get to that pretty soon. The second or the third bullet point group covers verses 5 through 9, and the question I asked was, are Christians free to worship God any day of the week? We had this discussion already about, is this a Saturday versus Sunday debate? Right? Like in today's circles, it's very popular to have these questions tossed around. Do we as Christians have to keep the seventh-day Sabbath? Or does the New Testament give us license and freedom to choose any day of the week, which would include Sunday or whatever as our day of worship? Are we still rigidly tied down to the seventh-day Sabbath? That becomes a topic of discussion in Christian circles. And we came to some semi-conclusions in our own study, and we'll again revisit those in time. The next bullet point, which covers verses 10 through 13, focused on the terminology that Paul uses in this letter, brother. Who are the brothers? We looked at the immediate context of the Christian brothers, the Jews and Gentiles, within the scope of Paul's letter and Paul's writing. There would be brother Christians to Paul. But at the same time, we also recognize that Paul addresses brother Jews from time to time throughout his letters. He does in Romans as well. He refers to his fellow Israelites as brothers. But at the same time, there are places in the Bible, in fact, all throughout the Tanakh, we're going to find that Israelite, whether they're Christian or not, whether they believe in Jesus or not, are known as the brotherhood of Israel, or the brotherhood of Jewish people. And how would Paul want his brother Christians, particularly his Gentile Christians, how would he want them to relate, if at all, to the brother Jewish people, the brother Israelites? Is there still a relationship there? Is there, what I'm trying to say, kind of a smaller context for this use of brother and a larger context of this use of brother? And how does that bear relevance for us today? How can we interact with Paul's writings and still have this appreciation, not just for the brotherhood of Christianity, but how do we as the church relate to Israel? In fact, in the video that we're going to watch near the end of our study, we're going to look at that topic directly. Are Israel and the church the same thing? Does God still have a plan for Israel? I hope you can stick around towards the end of the study for that particular video. In the next bullet point, we looked at, which covered verses 14 through 18, and we haven't really gotten to this yet. We will get to it. We're going to jump back into the food topics. What exactly does nothing is unclean in itself imply? When Paul says that nothing is unclean in itself, is he really trying to convey the idea that the dietary laws of the Torah are no longer really binding us on us as Gentile Christians? It's no longer relevant for us to make a distinction between, say, pork and shellfish and ham versus, say, chicken and turkey and other kinds of fish, like salmon or something. Or, everything's on the table, pun intended. Everything is acceptable. Nothing's unclean in itself. I mean, is Paul really just trying to tell us, don't worry about it. Just eat whatever's set in front of you. Don't raise any questions. He talks that way in other letters. Really, what's he trying to say? We'll look at that in time. We also are going to be looking at in verse 19 where Paul says, how can we make, this is my own question, how can we make for peace and mutual upbuilding? When we've got differences of opinion of, what's acceptable for eating, and what worship days should we worship on, and who is the church and who's Israel, and is the Torah relevant, and what do we make of prophecies that talk about the Torah being established in our hearts? What about prophecies of a temple being rebuilt in the millennium? And we've got all of these kind of heated topics that are so easy to divide us as Jews and Gentiles. How can we make for peace and mutual building? How can we come together as churchgoers, as Christians, who, if we have all these diverse opinions about, I haven't even hit on some of the other topics that we hear about in church circles, speaking in tongues, and who's got the Holy Spirit, and the identity of God, is he one, is he three, like we talk about in my Shema study. Paul says we need to make for peace and mutual building, but how is it even possible if we've got so many differences? We're going to talk about that when we get to that particular verse. As we move on into the questions that I provided in verses 20 and 21, I created a question that says, what does everything is indeed clean mean? That's going to be, again, a look at the dietary issues, but a little bit more expansive this time, because he talks about everything is indeed clean. This would kind of broaden the scope of even including ritual purities when it comes to maybe touching things that are unclean. How about touching a corpse? Do we still have corpse defilement today? How about attending a funeral? How about going to see one's loved ones when they're about to die and they're in the hospital? What if they die while you're there? Does that suddenly render you unclean? How about menstrual periods of women? In the Torah, that rendered you unclean. How about today? Does that still work? Everything a woman touched when she was menstruating was rendered unclean in the Torah. How about today? Does that mean suddenly you need to avoid men if you need to avoid women if they're menstruating? How would you even know, right? This could be a sensitive topic. So we'll talk about that in time as well. What does everything indeed is clean talk about? And then the last bullet point that I have in my list there is the topic of, or the question of, how do we keep the faith we have between ourselves and God? In verses 22 and 23, Paul admonishes the people, the faith that you have, keep it between yourselves. Wait a minute, Paul. Are you trying to say I shouldn't witness to people about my faith? That can't be what he means there, right? Well, if he doesn't mean keeping the faith of Yeshua to yourself, what exactly does he mean? If I have a particular perspective on food and the Torah and holy days and clean and unclean, should I keep that to myself, or should I share that with someone else? We'll talk about those questions in time as well. So that's basically the overview of my study. Let's turn back up to the conclusions and read some of this information. I'll just read it verbatim. I don't think I need to stop and explain it since it's fairly self-explanatory, okay? So we're going to start right there on my page, on my screen right now where it says in, and let me just read down through some of this, okay? In my study that I wrote, in the conclusion section, I say that in the end, the exact amount of Jewish and Christian social, religious, and communal involvement in ancient Rome, it may actually remain a mystery until we're all able to one day have a long-awaited conversation with Priscilla and Aquila. And I put the word smile there. You remember Priscilla and Aquila were some of Paul's fellow Jewish believers there in Rome. And we also know that during this time when Romans was written, like around the mid-50s of the first century, there was some activity that heavily impacted the Jewish community, particularly as we're going to read here. There was an expulsion order that was sent out by Emperor Claudius a little bit earlier than this time, and it impacted enough of the Jewish people that it disrupted social life. How many Jewish people were expelled from Rome? History doesn't give us an exact answer. There are some indications in the book of Acts itself that perhaps maybe even all of the Jews were expelled from Rome in a very short amount of time. I tend to think that account in the book of Acts is a little kind of overstatement, oversimplification. I'm not doubting the fact that the event did take place, but since there are no details given in the book of Acts by Luke the author, and since we don't have other historical writers like Josephus and other writers, Suetonius, that confirm the exact details of the expulsion, then we can also assume that perhaps maybe there were a significant amount that were expelled, or perhaps maybe it was just a concentrated amount of troublemakers that were put out. Either way, it did impact the Jewish community right around the time of or after of Paul's writing. And but Priscilla and Aquila would have been impacted. They would have probably been put out as Messianic Jews, and then they would have been allowed to return after Emperor Claudius had passed on and Nero had taken power there. I go to say on my commentary, but until that time, right, until we can figure that out, as Bible students and as historians, we can in fact gain a more well-rounded approximation of the situation by doing our due diligence today when it comes to historical research, right? Both Christian as well as secular research. And I do recommend that when you're studying through any particular book of the Bible, try to give yourself a more broadly rounded perspective than just what you might encounter if you were to read from any particular Christian book or Bible book itself. From the Bible, obviously, is going to be your principal place to start study, but you got to broaden your research. Sometimes you got to go to the bookstore, the library, and check out some history books and things like that, and allow history to help fill in the gaps where the Bible doesn't always tell you details, so that you can begin to not just appreciate, but begin to better understand and have a heart for what's taking place in your Bible, so that you can be better equipped to share that message with others. I say in my commentary, indeed, as a conclusion to this particular section on background and historical audience, Mark Nanos, remember, he's our modern Jewish historian that we're borrowing our notes from. He is not a Messianic Jew as far as I can understand his teachings. However, he is interested in Messianic and Christian teachings. He researches New Testament topics, and he does so with such precision that he becomes a valuable resource to those of us in Messianic circles, such as myself. I highly recommend reading through his commentaries. Mark Nanos, Nanos. He's got a few books out there, and we're going to be quoting from some of them from time to time as we work our way through this particular study. But he poses this timely and important question that I'm going to read here in a second with regards to properly appreciating the historical issues as they apply to Romans. So listen to this question real quick. This is Mark Nanos. He asks this question, quote, would the Gentile Christians, or the Christian Gentiles of Rome, would they have sought association with the synagogue as the, quote, righteous Gentiles, end quote? And if so, why? Why? There was a group of people in Paul's day that were regularly visiting the synagogues of their day. And these people were Gentiles who were interested in the God of Israel, the scriptures of Israel, the religion of Israel, the people of Israel, the teachings of Israel, the covenants of Israel. And as such, in their interest, they frequented the synagogue and they were welcomed into the synagogue circles. And many of them went on to become proselytes, and many of them went on to become full-blown Jewish converts. But there was an important group of people who didn't take on conversion, but nevertheless respected the scriptures of Israel, the God of Israel, and they, for all intents and purposes, took on the religion of Israel. So they practiced Judaism, but they didn't go the full step of conversion and become ethnic Jews or legally recognized Jews. And these were known as righteous Gentiles, God-fearers. You recall, what's his name? The Roman centurion in the book of Acts chapter 10, Cornelius, that met with Peter. He would have been a righteous Gentile in the eyes of Jewish people, meaning a Gentile who has not made conversion, but nevertheless respects Judaism as religion, claims monotheistic worship of Israel's one God, studies Israel's scriptures, and seeks to be pleasing to God as a Gentile. What type of lifestyle and behavior would this Gentile have engaged in? So Nanos asks the question, would the Gentiles in Paul's purview, in the scope of Paul's writings, would they have been familiar with the righteous Gentile model? And if so, would the Gentiles in Paul's letter, the recipients of Paul's letter, would they have been continuing to reach out to the Jewish synagogue to identify with them as a people group? Would they have continued to associate with them? I go on to say that I imagine his answer might surprise some. And in his book, The Mystery of Romans, which we're going to look at, he makes these particular sentiments. And so let's read just a little bit from Mark Nanos. Let me see how much I want to read here. Maybe we'll look at just the first paragraph, and then we'll pick this up next week. I don't want to spend too long here. We've got more material that we need to cover. Oops, didn't mean to do that. There we go. All right, this is Mark Nanos from his book, The Mystery of Romans, which I have sitting on my bookshelf here. It was put out back in the 80s, I believe, mid-80s, I believe, of this year, of this century, of this era, not like the 1800s or anything like that. So it's, I think, around 1980. And it's available, I think, Fortress Press. If I look, yeah, Fortress Press. I'll put a little screenshot on my screen in post-production so you can see what it looks like. It's a black book with red writing. Here's what Mark Nanos has to say. Speaking of those religious Jews and particularly those righteous Gentiles or Gentile Christians in Paul's day, Josephus indicated that Julius Caesar's decree forbid the assembly of foreign religious societies other than Jewish ones in the city of Rome, and according to Suetonius, Caesar had dissolved all guilds except those of ancient foundation. So right away, Mark Nanos, who is an historian, reminds us of, in Paul's day, it wasn't so easy to just simply start up a new religion, meet together, and go on your merry way without Rome getting involved in your business. All right, there were rules that forbade the assembly of other religions other than the Roman sanctioned ones. And one of the reasons was because it's no secret that the ancient Caesars considered themselves to be living gods among the people. And as such, they commanded state worship, and it was mandatory to bring a certain amount of tribute to the Caesars as living gods. And as such, if you engaged in other religions other than the ones that the state had sanctioned, then it was considered a form of not just heresy, but it was considered a bit of kind of sedition and treason. And so you had to be very careful in ancient Rome of the first century. You didn't want to lose your head over your choice to follow another religion other than the state-sanctioned Roman religions. So where did Christianity fit in with all that? Well, it wasn't the state religion just yet, at least not in Paul's day. It wouldn't be until after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, 70 AD, and even later on in the first century and moving into the early second century, that we begin to see and maybe even farther along than that, but second century, third century, right? You guys have heard of gosh, I'm forgetting his name right now, but he was the Roman ruler who eventually converted to Christianity, and his name starts with a C, Constantine, there we go. And he eventually accepted Christianity as a state-sanctioned religion. But before then, Christianity found its identity nested within one of the forms of Judaism. Even the New Testament attests to this fact that Christianity was a subset of Judaisms. Of one of the Judaisms was a sect of Judaism known as the Way, followers of the Way, the Nazarenes, whatever names you want to give them. They were using the name Christian here and there. We know that from the New Testament as well. But the point I'm trying to make, that Nanos is trying to highlight, is that there were no openly acceptable religions that were broadly recognized by Rome, and thus, as Mark Nanos says, how would Christians outside association with the synagogues obtain the right to congregate for fellowship and worship even in their own homes or in their tenement rooms, right? Unless, he says, they petition for designation as a quote-unquote private club. So this is important for us to begin to consider as we're working our way through historically the background to Paul's letter. How would the Jewish Christians have been able to openly and freely worship as Christians and enjoy the freedoms and the benefits of without being persecuted, worshiping their God. Remember, the Judaisms had already received an exemption to a degree from Rome. It came with its taxation, of course. Later on, we're going to read about and learn about what we call the Fiscus Judaicus, which was a tax that Rome levied against religious Jews and Jewish people in general if they wanted to continue having a measured amount of freedom to worship the way they want to, bringing sacrifices to their temple, not having to pay taxes to Caesar. Pay special kind of worship rights to Caesar. In other words, the Judaisms of Paul's day were able to enjoy a measured amount of exemption from the state emperor worship, the mandatory emperor worship, because of their monotheistic beliefs in the one God, right? For them, as Jews, as religious Jews, to give allegiance to Caesar as a god would be idolatry, right? It's idolatrous to recognize any other god other than Hashem as the one true God. And so how were they exempted? Well, Rome said in a word, fine, we'll exempt you from having to worship Caesar as a god, but you do have to send some prayers up to your God on Caesar's behalf, pray for him, right? And you're going to have to pay a little bit more than Roman citizens would pay, or non-Roman worshippers would pay. In other words, you're going to pay for your freedoms. So that's what we're talking about. This is where it becomes important for us to ask the questions about how did Christianity fit into this whole social religious setting. Were they exempt? Probably not. But wait a minute, if the Christianities were assumed to be a subset, a sect of Judaism, right? Remember, Judaism had many different denominations going on in the first century as well. We already know about at least two of them, or two or three that we read about in history and in the New Testament. We got the Sadducees as one sect of Judaism. We got the Pharisees as another sect, and we know at least about the sect of the Essenes, right? The people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's another third sect. But now we also had the Messianics, the Christians. This would have been another sect, right? The sect of the way. So at least four. There's perhaps more, and we know there's more from reading through history. But they were all sects of Judaism, which means Rome would have lumped them all together under the designations as Judaism, and therefore they would have found their exemptions under that umbrella identity as Jews. So even though they were Christians. So let's keep reading. I say, or this is Mark Natos. Not only do we not have any evidence of such an effort, right? Christians trying to make a break from their Jewish association so they can launch out on their own. We don't have any evidence of such an effort in history, but we also have good reason to believe that they did not, speaking of the Gentile Christians, they did not pursue such a course, as they found the authority of the synagogue sufficient, and they probably did not even consider the question at all at the time. Why would they seek to distance themselves from the synagogue, right? That just wouldn't come into their perspective like it does today. Your average Gentile Christian church doesn't have any association with the modern synagogue of today. Rabbinic Jews have their own religion and their own beliefs and their own perspectives on God, and Gentile Christianity with its different forms, Protestantism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and all the other forms of Christianity, they have their own separate and distinct perspectives on God, the Bible, who they are as a people group. So keep this in mind. Keep your antennas raised when we get to, for instance, my video at the end of the study tonight, where we ask the question, are Israel and the church the same thing? We have to ask these questions because we all have one Bible. Yeah, that's the kicker. The Jewish people and the Christians, for the most part, we use the same Bible. Most of it's the same, although Christianity has the latter third that's different and distinct from Rabbinic Judaism. That's true. So we're going to keep talking about this topic over and over again. Mark Natos continues, further, even if these Christians sought and were granted the rights of assembly of a private club, this would not have extended to the free practice of their religion without harm or interference, e.g., they would still not have had the right to observe the Sabbath. They would not have been free from serving in civic cults, like I talked about earlier, nor to the right to refrain from, as I mentioned, the mandatory practice of declaring Caesar as their God. Remember, Jews were exempt from this practice only by the institution of a special substitutionary sacrifice. We talked about this. It's because of this substitutionary sacrifice, right? The Jewish people were basically, they weren't sacrificing to the emperor. They weren't recognizing him as a god, but they were bringing in this extra sacrifice that the Torah had not prescribed. And this substitutionary sacrifice was in essence saying to the emperor, we're going to pray to God on your behalf and ask our God to continue to bless you and protect you and to continue to establish your rulership and keep you safe, etc., etc. You know, and this sacrifice is going to be our way of recognizing your authority in Rome and for allowing us a measure of exemption from having to do some other things. But this is our way of recognizing your protection and that we're praying for you as the ruler, as the Caesar. Thank you for allowing us to worship with the freedoms that we have, etc., etc. So that's kind of what's going on. I mean, that's not exactly what's going on, but does it mean that the Jewish people were recognizing Caesar as a god? No, they weren't. So, I mean, probably some were. You always have people in wherever you go that are just going to say, you know, let's just live and let live. You know, what's the big deal? You know, big deal. God's God, Caesar's God. You know, in my heart, I have my own beliefs, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, Mark Nanos concludes by talking about Christians would not have been exempted from the exclusion of military service and other public responsibilities with their concomitant idolatry. So this is important for us to be familiar with as we're reading through Paul's letters, because I'm just going to tell you right up front, I don't think that the Gentile Christians in Paul's letters were completely separate and distinct from their Jewish synagogal counterparts. I think they were still connected to one another, reasonably so, to the point that Paul could expect the two groups to have some interaction with one another, particularly when we read through Romans chapters 9 through 11 in Paul's letter to Romans. We know that he admonishes the Gentile Christians to continue to recognize Israel's special place in God's economy, particularly in salvation history. Paul goes on to remind the Gentile Christians that God blinded national Israel so that he could extend his grace and mercy to the Gentiles, who were these wild olive trees that was grafted into national Israel. So God established Israel as a people, and they blinded them in part, which allowed the Gentiles to come into the family group and to pick up their place in the family of Abraham as grafted in branches among Abraham's family, enjoying that place because of their faith in Messiah, not because of conversion, not because of any special deeds that they had done as Gentiles. Far from it. It's because of God's mercy to them as the one God of Jews and Gentiles. And then it's within that scope of God's reaching out to the Gentiles in the blindness of Israel that Paul admonishes the Gentile Christians to remember that they, the Gentile Christians, now have a responsibility to continue to reach out to these blinded, stumbling, disenfranchised national Israelites who don't yet accept who Yeshua is. I'm calling them the weak in faith, just as Mark Nanos does as well, to reach out to them with the gospel and continue to try to bring them back into the place where, as Paul puts it, all of Israel shall be saved. I would say around Romans 11, 25, 26, 27, somewhere around there. Paul still has a heart for national Israel, and you Gentile Christians should as well. And that's going to do it for our look at the Romans 14, Feast and Fast and Food, oh my. We'll pick up this study again in the second half of this quote from Mark Nanos in my conclusion section next week. All right?